Hello everyone, welcome to a class on the short story A Wagner Matinee by Willa Cather. It was published in 1904. Myself Arun Kumar from the Department of English, Government College, Manadawadi. About the author Willa Cather, she was an American novelist, short story writer as well as a poet who lived from 1873 to 1947. She worked as a magazine editor and also as a newspaper editor. Some of her novels are Alexander's Bridge 1912, My Antonia 1918, etc. So this means that she was writing in the first half of 20th century. She was basically known as an author of local color. So this phrase literature of local color must be familiar to you already. This precisely means that a particular writer is writing about the locality, a specific locality, its people and its ways of life in his or her novels or short stories or poems. So one famous example would be Thomas Hardy and the place called Wessex that appears again and again in his novels. So the novels of Thomas Hardy are called Wessex novels or Wessex tales. So about Willa Cather, she was writing mainly about frontier people. So the frontier people or the frontier region is a region that can be identified as the western, far western region of America or the midwestern regions of America. Places such as Nebraska, as in this story. Very often there is a male narrator in her stories who narrates the story of a woman character. As I already said, this story was published in 1904 in Everybody's Magazine. Later, it was included in the collections of various collections of short stories. Let's get to the story. This story, A Wagner Matinee, was it gets narrated by a character, a male character called Clark. He lives in Boston. Boston, we must keep in mind that it is not a frontier region. Boston is a city very much far away from the frontiers. So the incident that opens this story is the arrival of Aunt Georgiana, a woman character, into the city for some legal affair. She is from Nebraska. So Nebraska is one of the frontier regions, a faraway place from Boston. So the pattern or the surrounding kind of a story is very much set from the beginning itself, that we get a pattern that the story opens in Boston, where a woman from a very far away place such as Nebraska is arriving into the city. So with the arrival of Aunt Georgiana, Mr. Clark remembers and reflects or even he contemplates that he had once lived there as a boy. To be specific, in a place called Red Willow County. He also remembers that she was a music teacher before her marriage, and which was over 30 years ago, and she had worked there in Boston Conservatory. The incident that happens in the story is that Clark takes her to a concert, and this concert features an opera by Wagner, the famous German composer. Let's get to the plot of the story. The story opens with a letter arriving from Uncle Howard from Nebraska, and this letter is described as worn and rubbed, and the physical description of this letter in these terms, worn and rubbed, that indicates the kind of life they are going through, the ways of life that are experienced or led by these two characters, Uncle Howard and Aunt Georgiana. So there is already some kind of a doubt, or there is already some kind of a prejudice established even before the arrival of the aunt. This letter talks about the arrival of the aunt the very next day, and Clark goes to the railway station in order to receive the aunt. And Aunt Georgiana is in a sense, is a central character of this short story. She is described by Clarke as pathetic and grotesque, which is also a kind of the reflection of her ways of life in that kind of a place, that kind of a faraway place, and that kind of even a cruel place in terms of climate, such as Nebraska. Also, Mr. Clarke recollects his early days, his childhood days in Red Willow County in Nebraska. He thinks about the farm life, especially about the corn and the ways of farming it and harvesting it, things like that. And he says, those memories are something similar to an ocean that lies between his present moment and his childhood. He meets her at the station, and when he meets her face to face, the way he describes her is very interesting. She says, I'm quoting from the short story, she is charred, smoked. She looked like charred, smoked bodies that firemen lift from the debris of a burned building. Also, he goes on, linen duster, black with soot, black bonnet, grey with dust. These kinds of very uncity-like, so to say, that kind of descriptions that he is attributing to this old woman from Nebraska. So he also thinks again that she was at some point of time a music teacher, to be specific in 1860s, before she eloped with her husband Howard, and this elopement was very much against the will of her family. So she was working as a music teacher. She was a young woman. She was a happy, career-oriented, and to a certain extent, she was an established music player and also a singer, and she was famous. She was that kind of some sort of celebrity, and she decided to elope with Howard to this faraway land, Nebraska. And about Nebraska, here we get to hear more about Nebraska. And Clarke talks about the beginnings of their life. They're finding land, and the way they found their land and the way they built their home, these things in Nebraska. And this place where they built their home is almost 50 miles from railroad. So one can imagine how far away this must be from a place like Boston. Okay. Now, so which means her life gets trapped there for 30 years. So she is coming out of that particular place for the first time in 30 years. So this is some kind of a rejuvenating kind of an experience, some kind of a rediscovery for her. So she must be finding the whole city very strange, completely new and fresh. So everything has changed over the past 30 years, and again she is described in terms of dust and black and soot. Especially the color black is attributed to her again and again, is something that makes this story very much interesting. Black stuff dress beneath the duster, and yellow skin for her constant exposure to wind, ill-fitting false teeth, twitching of mouth and elbows. These are her physical descriptions. So these indicate a woman, a very old woman, a very old, very much unglamorous kind of a woman, and also a very old woman who is going much older. And this twitching of mouth and eyebrows are a form of nervous disorder due to loneliness and physical suffering. So by now it is an established fact that she is leading a life of loneliness and suffering in Nebraska, from a place she decided to go into, and where she spent 30 years of her life, and from where she is coming out for the first time in 30 years. Again, his memories continue of his first learning of Latin. So he recollects that she taught him Latin for the first time, and his first reading of Shakespeare, his first book of mythology, his first music lessons, etc. All this happened in Red Willow County when he was a boy. So he is very much thankful to Aunt Georgiana for all this. So he says it is as if his entire life, his entire self and his identity, for all this he owes to her so much. He again says that she is train sick, and she is train sick because she hasn't been on a train for a long time, very long time, and she doesn't even recognize the city. And at many places in the short story, he indicates that she is behaving as if she is sleepwalking, and he suggested to her visiting the conservatory, but she declined. She was not interested. So it is as if she has lost all the interest even of knowing the city, even after 30 years. So she is almost like a dead person, almost like a person who has lost herself completely. So this is so much so that she is declining the visit to her music conservatory, and instead, on the other hand, she was troubled about her home affairs. Even when she has come into the city after 30 years, the city does not excite her even a bit, and she is thinking about the milking of cows, a kit of mackerel, etc. These homely affairs she is all thoughtful about. So she is not even interested in the city at all, and she seemed ignorant of the Wagner operas, as if she was in a sleep. So he decided he suggested to her about going for the opera, but she was not much interested. Anyway, they decide to go for the opera. So even when she was entering the hall, she was moving, she was walking as if in a sleepwalk. And they enter the concert hall, a world from which she was dead for 30 years. So this idea of music performance, the scene of music performance, and a setting of a concert hall, and so many musicians and instrument players sitting side by side, and all of them are performing. These visuals, these images, she had been familiar with this. All these images were part of her life 30 years ago, and this is a world she has completely forgotten. She has completely lost it, and she is not even recognizing these things a second time. And her stony look, she is completely unemotional, unresponsive to all these things that are happening before her eyes, even after they enter the concert hall. So her stony look is compared to that of a museum statue and to that of a miner. So these two images, he is presenting before the readers these two images, the images of a museum statue who stands completely ignorant of the different kinds of changes that are happening in front of it, the different kinds of people who visit it, and their responses and their emotional responses, their excitement and their sense of wonder. All these responses, a museum statue is unresponsive, unemotional and aloof. So, and also like a miner. So she stands aloof, and she stands completely untouched by the concert hall, the concert hall that is filled with the city audience, very sophisticated urban men and women of the city, who who is clad in different multicolored clothes. These things she is completely unaware of, and she is completely uninterested in all these things. And the many colors of the other women's dresses are contrasted with her black dress. So this is one very interesting and one very significant physical description given by Clarke about the dressing patterns, especially the colors of the dresses of the city audience, and that is contrasted with her black dress. So she is dressed in black. Her bonnet, her overcoat, all these things are black, and they are grey with dust. But the other men and the other women, they are clad in black and velvet, black and red and different, and yellow and green and different kinds of colors. So that is one description that Clarke gives. Then afterwards the musicians enter and take their places. Also their dresses, their instruments, their shapes, the shapes of their instruments and the shapes of the colors of their dresses, the glows of their dresses, all these details are given by Clarke. And all of this is contrasted with Aunt Georgiana. Aunt Georgiana is a complete misfit there. And also, not only with Aunt Georgiana, all these things are contrasted with the place that she is coming from, that is Nebraska, especially her home. So her home is described as a naked home stands erect in a lone prairie, and a cornfield, endless cornfield. So Clarke says that if you start walking by sunrise, you will not stop. You will not be able to stop walking by sunset in order to reach the end of the cornfields. So that this indicates the vastness of that particular land. So this also indicates the amount of time, the amount of work that one needs to spend there in order to survive. So a very hard life, a life of suffering, a life of physical toil, a life of exhaustion has made this aunt a very unfortunate person, a person who has lost herself completely, a person who has forgotten music completely. So then after those memories, we get back to the present. When the first violins play, she clutches his coat sleeve. They broke the silence of 30 years. So this is a very striking moment, very emotional moment of the short story, when all the violinists sit together and they start drawing their bow and they start playing it. That sound, he says, breaks the silence of 30 years, and she is some kind of, she moves, she is moved suddenly, and she clutches his coat sleeve. Then again Clarke goes into various memories of the naked house on a prairie as a fortress, and black and dim kind of a life, and there is a black pond. So everything about Nebraska, everything about the prairie, everything about their house, their cattle, and their ways of life is described as black. So endless cornfields to the east, and endless corral to the west. So corral is this shed that is used to shelter cattle or any other animal. So they have, so to the east there is endless chorale, and to the west they have this cornfields. So and these memories go back in parallel with the musical performance from the concert hall. Then he realizes that the overture, which is an introductory musical piece of any opera, that closes, and Aunt Georgiana is very silent, and she is thinking perhaps as what she got in 30 years. That is, Aunt may be thinking about what is it that she gained in these 30 years. What is it that she gained from the life in Nebraska? So she might be thinking about all these penetrating questions. So that is the impression that Clark shares with the readers. And she was a good singer, she was a famous singer, she was a young woman, and she could have been a very famous musical celebrity, but she lost all that, and with her decision to elope with Uncle Howard, and a marital life of physical suffering and emotional suffering and loneliness, all those things have crushed her life to nothing, and now she is not even able to respond to an opera. Then the next session of the opera starts. He wonders if whether that music means anything at all to her. So Clark is not even sure whether she is able to respond to the music anymore. Then in a while, Clark notices that her fingers start working the piano score she once played. So she was a pianist, and she was an established artist, and while listening to the concert, Mr. Clark notices that her fingers are, unconsciously her fingers are working the piano score. So this piano score is something that she had played over 30 years ago. She had played perhaps the same score. So her fingers are working on that particular score. Then there is a description of her fingers also. So her fingers are now, they are mere organs, or from the story, they are mere tentacles. They are not meant for playing the piano. They are, they have changed into mere tentacles in order to work, in order to hold, in order to knead, in order to lift. So these are physical, mechanical labor. So her fingers have transformed into tentacles to perform mechanical labor, and also about her hands there is swollen palms, bent fingers, and also there is a wedding ring. So which is indicative of the marital life of suffering that she has gone through for 30 years. So the same fingers could have been playing the piano score for 30 years, but her choice of marrying this person and going to a place such as Nebraska, because of that choice, she has lost all further choices. Then at some point, Clark hears a quick drawn breath, and she starts, she breaks into tears. She starts crying, and she starts crying all over because of her. She starts crying perhaps because she thinks about the amount or the magnitude of her loss. So she is crying maybe because she is thinking about what she could have gained if she had stayed in Boston for the last 30 years. So Clark wonders, it never dies really then, the soul, he wonders. So Clark is confirmed of the fact that she is able to respond to the music now. So Clark is kind of realizing that that the one's passion, one's absolute aspiration for something, it never dies out, and it really comes back at a later point of time. And at that point of time, Clark compares her to a moss that has gone black and grey because it has lost life. It has lost all life, but when placed in water, even for a short while, it goes green again. So she is compared to a plant, a moss. It is black, but it can go green. So like that, the life in Nebraska has made her a black figure. So the Nebraskan life is black. Everything with the dim sky, the black pond, and she is described as wearing a black coat covered with soot which is black, and also her overcoat is black with dust or grey with dust. So these things are there, but then she is like a moss and she goes green again. And in the concert, many more sessions follow in the concert, and she cries continuously till the end of the concert. And when the concert is over, everybody leaves, and she's not ready to go. When the concert comes to an end, even Mr. Clark is not sure as to how much music is left in her and how much she has lost irretrievably. So the concert is over and everyone leaves except her, and she says to Mr. Clark, "I don't want to go, I don't want to go." And with this kind of crying out, with this kind of complaining and whimpering, the story comes to an end. So this is the plot of the story. And also we must discuss the setting of the story. There are two locations in the story, Nebraska and Boston. These two locations are the opposite of each other. These two locations are externalized into the characters, as one can see. These two locations are represented by Aunt Georgiana and Clark respectively. Aunt Georgiana represents Nebraska and Clark represents Boston. And there is absolute contrast between these two places. That is a contrast as much as there is in the binary, that is nature and culture. So Boston is represented as a place of culture, whereas Nebraska is represented as a place of nature, that is unrefined and uncultured and even savage. So this binary of nature and culture is very much operative in the contrast between these two places in this short story. So the grassland or the prairie is depicted as the cultural other of the city. So Boston is represented as a center of development because there are railway stations and there are hotels and there are concert halls and there is very much development, these kinds of things. So Boston is represented as the center of development, the center of culture, because there is musical opera, there is center of culture, that is a center of urban life, the center of city, sophisticated, polished, wealthy kind of a life. All these are reflected by the descriptions of the kind of audience who gather in the concert hall, and the very polished, their glossy kind of behavior, their glossy dresses, the multicolors that their lives are filled with. So all these multicolors are contrasted with the black description of Aunt Georgiana. So the prairie is described or depicted as the cultural other of the city. So Nebraska becomes more than a landscape, more than a geographical entity. It becomes a way of living when it is compared with Boston. So even Mr. Clark is very much nervous of receiving the letter and also of receiving Aunt Georgiana, because upon getting the letter, Clark is nervous whether it will risk, it will put his identity at risk, because the letter, after he gets the letter, he describes his mental changes in very nervous terms, in almost hysteric terms. So even the thought of going back to the memories of Nebraska will put his life in risk. So this place is a metaphor for the character's sense of themselves. So Clark is enjoying a superior position, as we can see from the short story. Mr. Clark he occupies a very superior position, and his superior position is confirmed by an inferior woman. So there is this very much gender binary of a male female, because a superior man, an urban man, a city man, a sophisticated man, and a man of culture is describing a woman of quite opposite nature, a woman of frontier region, a woman of nature, a woman not having culture, a woman of poverty, a woman of suffering, and a woman who has lost her life at all, to summarize it. So an inferior woman. So Mr. Clark he emerges as a superior man by describing an inferior woman such as Aunt Georgiana. There is this very stark contrast between the domestic space of Nebraska and the urban space of Concert Hall. So the domestic space of Nebraska is described to the minutest details possible, to the even the pond, the front yard, the walls, and the pillars of the house, the cloth line in which they hang the cloths. All these things are described in great detail, and these great details are details of poverty, they are details of decline, they are details of deterioration, and they are details of the lack of culture. And whereas this urban space of Concert Hall there is wealth, there is polish, and there is the polished nature of human beings and their sophisticated behavior, and their emotional and their intellectual responses to this opera, the line of musicians who sit on the stage, and these things, they are contrasted with each other in order to make Nebraska the cultural other of Boston. Then about the narrator, we know that the story is narrated by Clark, and he is an urban male, and he associate them, that is, he associate Uncle Howard and Aunt Georgiana consciously or unconsciously to a savagery and of nature, the savagery of nature, and he stands as an outsider. So there is life of Nebraska, and this life is lived by Aunt Georgiana and Uncle Howard and their endless cornfields and their innumerable animals that they shelter. So that kind of a life, he chooses to stand as an outsider. He says that he spent his childhood days there, but he left it. He is thankful to it, but he is not part of it anymore. So it is very interesting that he chooses to distance himself from it. Also, he doubts his aunt's ability to be an insider in the city. So he always says that his aunt Georgiana is sleepwalking. It is as if she's on a she's in a sleep, and At one point he even says that it is better not to wake this woman and send her back just like this without waking her. So he says this. So his aunt is represented through his urban male memory and his urban male self. So at the same time he respects her and he is repelled by her, because he describes her as grotesque and pathetic, but he has awe and respect for her. So he is repelled by her and he respects her at the same time. So this story is a story of Mr. Clock as much as this is a story of Aunt Georgiana. So this story is a story of his happiness, his satisfaction of not being the other. And who is the other? This other is the aunt, the uncle, and also the place called Nebraska. Our prime focus of this short story is Aunt Georgiana. Interestingly, Aunt Georgiana has only a name. She has no voice. She does not speak except the final words, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. Even those words are not assertive. Those words are a cry. Those words are words of pain and agony and suffering and her helpless situation. So I don't want to go is not a strong assertion, rather it is a complaint of helplessness. So Aunt Georgiana was once a pianist, and she is worn out completely by a married life and physical suffering, emotional suffering, and also loneliness. So she is a person who is an oppressed woman in a male dominated society. So Aunt Georgiana is almost silent, as I said, almost silent throughout the story, and which indicate her inability to speak for herself. She is denied a voice. She does not have a voice. So as the subaltern cannot speak, as Spivak would say, so her inability to speak for herself and her lack of voice is very much reflective of her oppressed condition. She is represented as black in the story many times, and this blackness is associated with the savage place where she is coming from. So her gender identity as an oppressed woman is also linked. It is also entangled with this with the identity of her place, Nebraska, as a savage place. So the savageness of the place is attributed to her as well, and she has lost the culture she once had. She was a cultured woman in Boston. So there are many binaries in this novel, city village binary or city country binary, and there is also nature culture binary, and also there is male female binary. So she is reduced to a ghost like figure, and she goes as if she is walking in the city, and she is completely unable to link herself, to associate herself, to connect herself with the urban space, because when she enters the concert hall, she is totally unresponsive. She does not know where she is. She does not know the purpose she is there, and she does not question, she does not challenge, she does not speak. So her inability to associate herself with the urban space is reflective of her reduced identity, her reduced self as an oppressed woman, and she is at the mercy of others, which is very, very clear at the end of the story, because she says, I don't want to go. This I don't want to go, as I said, is not an assertion, it is a cry. So I don't want to go is a choiceless complaint, because she does not have a choice. She must return to Nebraska. So Aunt Georgiana is a woman without choices. She also realizes that her soul lives in spite of 30 years of suffering, at the end of the story, she realizes that she can relive and she can rediscover herself, but then she does not have a choice. She must go back. She also realizes the amount of loss of her life, the amount of self-realization, the degree of the magnitude of self-realization, the magnitude of chasing of dreams, the magnitude of herself that she could have had in those 30 years, which she has lost. So she realizes her losses, and she realizes her ability to rediscover. Also, she realizes her position without a choice, where she is forced to go back to the place she has come from. So all these things, that is a marital life, a physical torture, emotional suffering, loneliness, and this complete loss of one's passion, all these things are the main themes of the story, as we can see. And there is very much symbolism of music, as one can see, because the title comes from Richard Wagner, who was a very famous German composer, and this opera is a very much urban, cosmopolitan culture, as opposed to the silent prairies in Nebraska. So as I said, prairies are described as silent, where the urban space is not silent because it is filled with the many kinds of voices of voices of many events of culture, such as opera. So here music is represented as a symbol for herself, and because it was once it was her passion, and she gives it up for domestic life. She chooses domestic life with Uncle Howard, and she elopes with him. So music is a symbol of herself, and she completely loses it, and she goes into a state which is very much similar to death, which is very much similar to sleepwalking, and she wakes up in the concert hall, and music stirs the chords of herself, and because she even she thought that she had lost it, but she rediscovers it. So as a signal of that, she starts working her fingers. She starts working the fingers and playing the chords of the piano, the same chords perhaps she might have played over 30 years ago. So this concert awakens her sense of self, because it symbolizes her sense of self on the one hand, and this awakens her sense of self, and also along with this awakening, this discovery, she is conscious of her sense of loss and her sense of tragedy of her life. And as a conclusion, this is a story of a woman, Aunt Georgiana, narrated by a man, and the story of her loss of self in marital life. So this story is very much about the woman, very much about her loss of self in marital life. So the story is very much about the nature of marital life, in which women undergo physical suffering as well as loss of self, and the mental agony and suffering that women undergo in marital life. So interestingly, there is patriarchal force is very much operative in terms of marital life, in the form of the marriage between Uncle Howard, and the raising of children, the domestic life, managing the household, looking after the farming, etc. So these things put together, they crush the sense of self of the woman. One hand. Secondly, there is this Mr. Clark. He stands as an outsider, and he emerges as a superior figure, and he is completely sympathetic towards Aunt Georgiana, and at the same time he makes her the other of himself. He makes her the other of his male urban cosmopolitan identity. So, and it is part of that othering that he others the place, that is Nebraska. Nebraska is represented as the cultural other of Boston in his attempt to make his aunt the other of himself. So, Mr. Clark is very much happy, Mr. Clark is very much satisfied for not being Aunt Georgiana or not being Uncle Howard. And also the story is about her loss of self and her rediscovery of it at the opera. So, there is a possibility of rediscovery, but this rediscovery is not a new beginning. She must go back, she must return to Nebraska. So, she is a person, she is a woman without choices. So, music figures in this short story as a symbol of herself. She loses it, she discovers it again. And the story presents before us women without choices, because she must return. And one can see that this story bears interesting similarities, interesting striking parallels with the play Trifles and Minnie Foster, because in both the stories music appears as a symbol for the sense of self of the women characters. In Trifles, Minnie Foster was also a musical performer, some kind of a singer or a musical performer at some point of time, a very young, elegant and a young woman, elegant woman, and was like a famous woman and like a celebrity. And after her marriage with Mr. Wright, her life was reduced to nothing, almost nothing, and it was an insignificant life, and she has lost a very long career completely only because of the pressures of marital life. And the same thing happens in this story as well. And in both the stories, or in both the texts, music is a symbol of the sense of self of the women characters. So this story has very much similarities with the play Trifles. So I hope you have read the story firstly, and I hope you can connect it with the play Trifles. And also I hope that you can read it as a story of the women's suffering in marital life and their loss of self and their condition of being depicted as the other of male, as the other of city, as the other of culture, etc. So these kinds of readings are possible from this very beautiful short story, and in my opinion this is perhaps the best short story in our collection. So I hope you will enjoy a happy reading. Thank you.